Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. It turned into a weirdly very busy recruiting week. I don't want to say weirdly because we had a group of June visits. A lot of kids took a lot of visits in June. And so it wasn't weird, but there were a slew of commitments that happened over July 4th weekend. LSU got a pair of defensive linemen that they desperately need. Brian Kelly has not recruited that position group very well. I saw Notre Dame got a kid, a 4-star defensive back. But the big name that committed over the course of the weekend. By the way, I think producer Matt's Auburn Tigers picked up a commitment or two. But at the same time, the story that stood out was Dakorien Moore, the number one wide receiver in the country, had previously committed and decommitted from LSU. He did, in fact, make a college announcement. This was on the night of July 4th. His final four was Oregon, Texas, LSU, and Ohio State. And he commits to the Oregon Ducks. And so Oregon gets commitment. First of all, let me say this. Seems like a sweet kid, had his mom on the podium with him. It was a cool commitment ceremony. This thing went on forever. Like this was the longest commitment ceremony ever. It was on Instagram Live. I was watching the dog. I decided to tune on in just to see what ends up happening. And sure enough, this kid is on Instagram for about 40 minutes before he ends up committing. But Oregon gets the number one wide receiver in Dakorien Moore. If that was the story, though, probably wouldn't be talking about it because Oregon gets big-time recruits all the time. But coming out of the commitment, there was quite a bit of brushback from specifically the schools that did not get Dakorien Moore that maybe, just maybe, even in this world of NIL, even in this world where all these schools are spending all this money, maybe Oregon's playing on a completely different level than anybody else. As a matter of fact, producer Matt, why don't you pop up the tweet that I sent you earlier in the day? Because we have this from a guy who covers Ohio State. He does a great job. But he tweeted this out from SiriusXM. He said, Rick Neuheisel on ESPN College Football XM said he was at a recent coaches event. And it's no secret Phil Knight is supplying Oregon with unlimited NIL resources. Rick said Phil is 86. He desperately wants to see a championship, so they're willing to pay whatever it takes to get players. So I saw that. Also, as of about 6 Eastern time on Monday, if you Googled Oregon NIL, the first thing that pops up on YouTube, because YouTube, of course, is linked to Google, is a YouTube link from a Texas YouTube page that says Oregon is making NIL life hard for Texas. So, first off, I find it absolutely hysterical that we have Ohio State. As I said a minute ago, Ryan Day was spending NIL money like he had 2 months to live and he had to put together the best football team he could. Texas, we know that NIL is not an issue for them. So when you have Ohio State and you have Texas complaining, I find that absolutely hysterical. But let's get into this idea of, does Oregon ultimately have NIL money, unlimited NIL money? And let's take it a step further. Does it really matter, and how much of an impact does it have? Because to me, when I look at this story, what I'll say is that it reminds me of something that we have talked about, a term that I've used a lot on this show. As I say often on this show, two things in life can be true. But even if they seem different, they can both be true at the same time. And so while I think that Oregon has pretty unlimited NIL, I'm also not sure that, one, they're the only one that pretty much has any money that they need. And two, let's take it a step further. I don't think it's the reason why they're getting all these kids. I think it's a great school that has a great history of success during these kids' lives. They recruited well in the pre-NIL era. Dan Lanning's a dog. And I think this has some, but certainly not all, to do with NIL. And so let's start with the obvious. First of all, Phil Knight, this story about Phil Knight, not really surprising because we know that Phil Knight has been funding Oregon athletics for decades now. It's really, you can kind of correlate the rise of Oregon sports with Phil Knight being a major donor. Last time I checked, he's worth $33 billion, so money isn't an issue. But the only difference between this era and 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago is that money now goes towards NIL. 30 years ago, it was towards the head coach and the assistant coaches and facilities, and obviously in Oregon's case, uniforms and gear. So this money has always been there. It's going towards NIL. And I do believe that Oregon's in the upper tier. I don't believe that they have significantly more money to spend than Texas or Ohio State or Texas A&M or some of these other schools that we know are really well funded. I also think it's worth noting a couple other things. Oregon has been recruiting at an elite level since long before the NIL era. I just went back the last 5 or 6 years. Just to see, make sure I'm not tripping over, okay? So 2019, Oregon has the number 7 class in all of college football. 2021, the number 6 class in the country. 2022, now this is interesting because this was the year that Dan Lanning took over as the head coach, had the number 13 class in a transition year where they signed fewer players than everybody else. 2023, they have the number 9 class. And 2024, a year ago, they had the number 3 class in the country behind only Georgia and Alabama. So this idea that this is somehow new and only NIL related, I don't buy it. I think it's also worth noting this. You have to remember that kids that are currently in high school, they have only grown up knowing Oregon as an awesome program, okay? Think about so Chip Kelly led Oregon to a national championship game in the 2011 season. Producer Matt is smiling because, of course, they lost to the Auburn Tigers. Michael Dyer's knee may have been down, but that's neither here nor there. But I bring it up because 2011, to you, to me, doesn't seem that long ago. Well, it was 13 years ago. An 18-year-old kid who is a senior in high school right now, 5 years old at that point. So from 2011 on, Oregon, from Chip Kelly, Mark Helfrich, remember, he was only there, 3 years, but they played for a national championship in one of those years, lost to Ohio State. Mario Cristobal won the Pac-12 in 2019 and 2021 and 2022, had a team good enough to make the college football playoff in all 3 of those years. I just bring it up to say that from Kelly to Helfrich to Cristobal to now Dan Lanning, they've always been good, and that's all that high school players know. So the way that me, as a dude in my 30s, the way that I grew up, Nebraska was always awesome. Miami was always awesome. The Florida Gators were always awesome. Well, for kids in this generation, it's Alabama, it's Clemson, it's Oregon, it's Ohio State, it's a few others, but Oregon is in that conversation. And so you have a school that's always recruited well, a school that, yes, has NIL, but also a school where every high school kid only knows them being awesome. And can we take half a second and maybe give Dan Lanning half a bit of credit here? Because you can have all the NIL money in the world, but if you don't know how to use it and you don't know how to get players to come in and then develop them once they get there, kids aren't going to keep coming. And so what kids now see at Oregon is, yes, there's probably really good NIL, but the team keeps winning. Dan Lanning is a third-year head coach. Went 10-3 in year 1, 11-2 a year ago, was 12-2, I think, actually, was easily good enough to make the college football playoff. Remember, it's easy to forget now. They were a double-digit favorite against Washington in the Pac-12 championship game, okay? That's how good they were. He's developing NFL guys. Bo Nix went from, hate to say it, producer Matt, but essentially unplayable under Brian Harsin and Gus Malzahn to a Heisman finalist and first-round pick under Dan Lanning. And so Oregon has everything right now needed to compete at the highest level. And I only think it's going to get better. And I do believe, I'll say this, and I've said this on the show. Every time I credit Dan Lanning, everybody's like, well, what has he really done as a head coach at Oregon? It's like, well, listen, I know he hasn't won a national championship yet. He's also like 37 years old, and he's only been a head coach for 2 years. And in those 2 years, he's 22-5, okay? 22-5, including in a year that was the toughest Pac-12 ever. Now, I know it's going to get tougher going into the Big Ten, but I think in some ways the Big Ten isn't totally ready for what Oregon's going to bring as well. Because I don't think you can say Oregon should be favored over Ohio State in the Big Ten. Even the Vegas odds, we talked about them a few weeks ago, Ohio State's a 1-point favorite at Oregon. But Oregon is a favorite against Michigan. Oregon will be favored in every other game they play except for Ohio State this year. And so you look at Dan Lanning. You look at what he's done. Yes, I believe NIL is a factor. I also believe Dan Lanning's a rising star. I believe that he took that Southeastern Conference recruiting infrastructure from Kirby Smart, from Nick Saban, and he brought it to the West Coast. I've told this story before, but my buddy Justin Hopkins covers Oregon for scoopduck.com, part of On3. We had him on my radio show about a year ago after the Big Ten move. He said, man, I was here for the Mario Cristobal years, but I ain't seen nothing like what Dan Lanning does. Dan Lanning has a plan for high school sophomores, for high school freshmen, for transfers, for junior college, for portal, for graduate transfers, for guys with 1 year in the portal, for guys with 3 years in the portal. He said, I've never seen anything like it. I think we're starting to see dividends. I think Oregon is a team that is good enough to win the national championship this year. Yes, I think I think NIL plays a role, but no different than it does at Texas, at Ohio State, at all these other schools that everybody loves. Congrats, Oregon fans. You again have a team that's good enough to win a title. And at least for right now, you have Dakorien more committed. Also worth noting, saw that there's a crystal ball out for the number one linebacker in the country, Jonah Williams, a kid out of Texas. Now, he's a little bit of an interesting story because he's a baseball player as well. And I think that Schloss mix-up, Texas A&M, Texas, may have pushed him away from those two Texas schools. DJ Pickett, an elite cornerback. A lot of people think he's going to go to Oregon as well. But at the end of the day, I'm just going to say it. I don't believe that NIL is the only reason that Oregon is recruiting well. And oh, by the way, if you think that NIL is the only factor, I can't really help you. Don't know what else there is to say.